Wildlife Studies. My name is Jeff Stetz. I'm the Director of Science and Assistant Professor here at the Center. One of the favorite parts of my job is helping to coordinate this series, which we see as a chance to help educate the public on a range of topics related to wildlife conservation, research, conservation planning, and so on, while showcasing some of the amazing work that our colleagues and staff are involved with. Uh, Today, just in case, if your mic wasn't muted, please take a second to do that. There'll be plenty of time for questions following the presentation. You can either come on camera or put them in chat. John will be happy to try and answer those at the end. With that, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Jon Martin, a forest scientist whose 3-decade career has been devoted to understanding how forests grow, change, and sustain both people and the planet. John's work brings together science and stewardship, exploring how forests respond to climate, disturbance, and human care, and how landowners and communities can play an active role in conserving the landscapes they value. Jon earned his PhD in forestry from the University of Minnesota and spent many years as a faculty researcher at Oregon State University. From 2012 to 2025, he shared his passion for hands-on ecology and forestry with students at Northland College. Known for his field-based approach, Jon's research has taken him from studying forest carbon and wildfire impacts to climbing high into the forest canopy. In addition to teaching courses with CWS, Jon is an affiliate scientist with the Burke Center for Ecosystem Research and works directly with landowners and as a consulting forester. Whether in the classroom, the woods, or high in the treetops, Jon brings together science, conservation, and a genuine sense of curiosity about how forests work and why they matter. And with that, I will hand it over to Jon.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for that wonderful intro. You made me sound pretty good. That was nice. That was nice. Well, so welcome everybody. I appreciate you taking your time out on this Wednesday. Not all of us are in sunny Florida, but wherever you happen to be, welcome. Like Jeff was saying, my name is Jon Martin. I am a retired professor of forestry and natural resources from Northland College. Retired in the sense that our college closed. But I do a little research on the side with the Burke Center, excuse me, which is an offshoot of our college Center for Ecosystem Research, sort of a I don't know, think tank kind of thing. But my main focus is consulting forestry now. My focus is to work with private landowners and help them match their values with the things that they're interested in maintaining in their forests. And so today, like Jeff mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we all need a little forestry, and specifically how understanding forests and the tools and the techniques that we use can help the thing that we're all after, which is appropriate amounts of conservation. So the first thing I've got on tap for us is I need you to get your smartphone device styled thing out, and here is a little MS Forms quiz for you. If you want to scan that QR code, it'll take you to a Microsoft Forms survey, and there's a question on there I'd like you to read and agree with or disagree with. The statement, there's two of them. The first one has to do with the impact of logging and deforestation in North America. You know, how much of an impact is that or threat to wildlife? Do you agree? Do you disagree? And the second has to do with selective logging. So if we were to log selectively instead of using clear cuts, could we improve how forests ecosystems function and still produce some products? So I see one person there's two, very good. Ooh, some disagreement. Very good. I swear this is a safe link. There we are. And I don't know how many people we have on. We have 510 here. Okay. Give a couple seconds here. Pretty good. Pretty good. All right. So in general, with those statements, there's pretty strong agreement, a couple of very strong agree with these statements about forestry and forest management. Oh, still getting a few more. There we go. Very good. Now, before I get into some of the details we'll talk about today, I will say that this question is heavily engineered to be sort of misleading. And it's one of the things that I wanted to talk about today. So, give you another second here. Anybody left? Okay, we'll move on here. So it turns out that actually both of those statements are wrong. And we're going to spend some time talking about sort of why they're wrong, but it brings me to sort of the focus of what it is we're here today for, which is to kind of understand the impact of seeing that how we understand forest and talk about it can help us speak a common language. And that's a really important component when it comes to conservation efforts. And that we're also going to see today that forestry can be a really important tool for researching and monitoring, restoration, and our overarching conservation goals, right? These tools and techniques that we highlight in forestry it, are all encompassing and will benefit anybody in research monitoring fields, as well as a lot of the hands-on stuff that we need to get done when we're working in conservation. So when we think about what I just said there, and I don't want you to get the feeling that I'm planted here as a industry shill, a PR person for the forest products industry. I've been in this field a long time. I come at it from an ecological background. There are many issues with the state of our forests here in North America, certainly globally. There's a lot of issues with the way that we do manage. And it's sort of my impression from all of the work that I've done is that of these, a big one is that we spend a lot of time in forest management making too many successional shifts, meaning that we spend a whole lot of time shifting forests back in succession and keeping them young. And that's when they're really productive. That's we do that for logical reason, right? But it results in a lot of habitat issues. Now, other things that we do that are wrong in our forests, if you ask me, is that there isn't enough good fire. There isn't enough fire in general. Even though we hear about a lot of really big fires and dangerous fires, turns out the natural state is to burn a whole lot more. And so we need a whole lot more good fire. There's also not enough components of our sorry, I'm gonna drag this here. There's not enough components that are important to a lot of other species, like a diversity of forest species, of forest ages, of structural components, spatial diversity, right arrangement on the landscape of forest types, and certainly not enough deadwood out there, snags, coarse woody debris, and things like that. As with most things, too, an issue that I feel that we have with the state of our forests and forest management is we still don't quite know enough, and we're certainly not doing enough good, informed restorative actions that are science-based and culturally important. We're not doing enough, right? Now, part of these issues are kind of related to another issue I have that you may not actually agree with, is that an issue I feel that we have in our forests and with forest management here in North America is that there's actually a reduction in the amount of locally produced forest products and properly valued forest products. Forest products are really cheap. They're way out in the woods. The economics of it are really challenging. And as a result, we're seeing a lot of changes in the global markets of things. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. And another thing I think that's really important, and again, you may not agree with, but there is a lack of acceptance of and the means to actually do a lot more small scale harvesting. I've seen a lot and studied a lot, and I think we should actually be harvesting a bit more, but doing it in different ways. And we can't really do this because of the economic means of getting the work done. A lot of timber markets here in the Lake States are shutting down because of mill closures. And there's a lot of restoration work that needs to happen, a lot of work I do with private landowners, and they don't want to just make money. They actually like to shift their forest into different forest successional stages and restore some old growth. And they can't get that done because no one's there to buy the wood and actually cut the trees down. And then lastly, I think one of our big issues is that we culturally in the natural resource field have separated the fields of forestry and wildlife. They once were one thing, and then they've became two. And so we have a lot of forestry people that don't have proper wildlife training, but we have a lot more wildlife people that haven't had a whole lot of forestry. And so next task for you, get your smartphones ready. You got the drill. Here's a question for you. I see in registering this, some of these are some similar questions, but I too am curious. What is your current professional status? A couple of options here. Are you involved in the research world, in fisheries and wildlife, and collecting a bunch of data? Do you work on issues related to wildlife or fisheries conservation? Um, Through habitat restoration, things like that. How many of you are working as a natural resource professional but don't directly work in fisheries or wildlife? And how many of you are students that are interested in numbers and data collection and answering questions with research and monitoring? Or how many want to go into conservation protection? Um, and again, you can choose more if you're interested in all of it. And then lastly, yeah, maybe you're just a concerned citizen. So what do we got there? So a few professional scientists, got some students. There we go. Yeah, good to hear. All right. There's a ninth. And what else we got? Okay, nine folks. So pretty good distribution here, but heavy in the wildlife and fisheries research and monitoring crew and folks that are interested in fixing things, which is great. Keep your phones out. I got one more question for two more questions for you. So I'm curious in your experience with forestry, which of these sort of expresses your your training? Not a lot. You've had a course or two. You've had some specific courses. All right. Ooh, some professionals out there. There we go. Folks have worked in the field. Very good. Yeah. So quite a few folks with some training. Yeah, very good. All right. There we are. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good to see. That folks are at least a little well versed. So some of the terms I use today. I got one more question for you. And so this one has to do with some of the issues associated with forest management and what kind of impact it may have on the work that you're involved in, the work that you're doing. And so some options are habitat loss. And again, choose the ones that you're that apply. You can choose many here. Changes in wildland fire, hydrology, carbon cycling, changes in rural economies. Yeah, pretty even split. Couple more seconds here and see how people are doing. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so the main focus here and interests of issues for folks tend to be the wildland fire, changes in hydrology, carbon cycling, um, and yeah. Okay. Well, that's good to know. So I'm curious about these things because I'm curious about your own experiences and in choosing this last question here, your answers certainly are justified because forest management can certainly impact all of those. Some of them for the better, but the majority of them will change it negatively relative to our current base state. And so when I think of what we're going to talk about today and how it's going to fit into your interests here, I think there's a lot of components that will highlight the impacts of forestry education and why we all need a little bit more. Now, time is short, I know. We can't be masters of everything, but we probably should try a little bit. And so when we get into forestry education, there's a few components I want to talk about today that I think are really important. And so when we start digging into what forestry is, we can certainly see that it helps us understand our habitats we're working with, our systems we're working with, and the skills and techniques to fix that. That's a critical component. And also is within forestry by design and history, there's a lot of the hard skills that we use every day in research and monitoring and restoration. Forestry is very data heavy, very spatial data heavy. We use a lot of techniques and tools that have been um, developed through agronomy and other things and used in a lot of other fields. And certainly the hard skills to get out there and get the work done in the woods, but also restore things, herbicide use, fire, chainsaws, things like that. It's also really important, I think, that as we gain a little forestry knowledge and forestry education, it can really help us with the conversations that we have about conservation. Communication is a two-way street. And so if we know it helps us listen and translate, and it helps us then turn that communication outward. And when we try and have conversations with people about conservation, we can be more effective. We can be more accurate, more precise in what it is we're trying to say. And in doing so, as we learn, I think it also helps us reframe our views. We'll talk about sort of local forestry and some global forestry issues here in a bit, because as we learn, we can learn that things may be not as bad as we seem locally. Globally, we still have some issues. And then lastly, when we dig into what forestry is, like with that first example, how we can use it to understand and fix habitat. Forestry is also really important because through it and the techniques that we use and the monitoring of these systems, we can continue to understand what is wrong in our forests and potentially use the tools we have or develop new tools to fix it. And so let's get in to some of the specifics. And so I mentioned forestry, I think, is really important because it helps us understand the habitat, and it certainly helps us understand what's needed to fix the habitat. When we look globally, 31% of our global land is a forest. So odds are if you're interested in wildlife and you're not swimming, you're probably in a forest. 36% of the US is forested. So a lot of the work that we're doing out there is in forested habitat. A lot of our interests, a lot of our issues. And whether or not you're interested in that, working in forests, maybe you're a range ecologist or you're interested in marine systems or freshwater systems, forests have a big role in many of the processes that are affecting us all. So forests drive the global carbon cycle. When we think of the role of forests, 65% of terrestrial carbon is in forests. There's about twice as much carbon in forests right now as sitting in the atmosphere. Those are pools. What's also really important is that these forest systems cycle a lot. And it turns out about 120 petagrams of carbon of the 750 petagrams that are stored in the atmosphere go into forests and are cycled annually. About 16% of the carbon in the atmosphere enters a forest and leaves it. Photosynthesis and respiration. So big changes in forestry, forest management, forest issues can certainly affect a thing that affects us all. The other thing is pretty simple. When we think of the woody vegetation out there that makes up the forest, right? For many of the work that's done with wildlife, terrestrial wildlife, right? That is the habitat that you're working in. So understanding it is key. But also really important is that it can potentially be the system that is restored or conserved, right? It's a whole lot easier to work on conservation issues from a habitat standpoint, right? It's a whole lot easier to work with habitat than it is with wildlife when it comes to changes. Because sometimes when we're dealing with forests, dealing with conservation and restoration issues, it's really easy and okay sometimes to kill vegetation and to regenerate maybe a different type of vegetation. It's really hard to do that with mammal species, right? With animal species. So the woody vegetation is the foundation. The forest systems can be the habitat and can be the thing that we work with very easily. And of course, obviously they need it. And the other thing a lot of people don't realize, right, is the woody vegetation is a very commercial product. As part of the issues with forests around the world is trees are very valuable. Well, fairly valuable. They're useful to people. So when we think of the commercial value of them, um, it opens up a whole nother set of issues when it comes into conservation of rural communities and industries and things like that. But it's also an avenue we may consider because that woody vegetation might have a commercial use. Utilizing it, harvesting it, might supply funds for some of the conservation and restoration work. This is becoming more and more popular. If you can get the work done, there's a lot of places out there where the habitat would benefit from a big change, and that big change could be a very commercial opportunity. A lot of our western forests where fire's been suppressed, a lot of encroachment, woody encroachment in savanna type systems, things like that. And so it's within this idea where forestry really shines. Now, forestry can help us fix and understand our habitat issues because within forestry is a very diverse mission and defined specifically as this interdisciplinary profession embracing the science and the art and the business of creating, managing, and conserving forests and associated resources in a sustainable manner to meet desired goals, needs, and values, right? So within forestry, we've got contained in there a conservation ethos. We don't necessarily always use it, but forestry has the power and the capability to do some amazing things with habitat. And specifically, the subfield of civiculture within forestry is how we get things done. We define this as the practice of controlling forest composition, structure, and growth to maintain and enhance a forest utility for any purpose. And so if you need to fix forest habitat, using forest management principles may be the key. And it may actually um, generate some money, but more often than not, you're gonna need some money to get some things done based on the forest markets. All right. Now, lastly on this, I wanted to mention that when we're dealing with trying to understand and fix habitat, a lot of what we know and the way we feel about conservation issues, we owe to our forestry past. Leopold, the star to all the wildlife people and to all conservationists, had a beginning in forestry. From forestry gave rise to game management, which is what we now know as wildlife ecology. Leopold was a tinker, loved forestry, loved to mess around in the woods, and had some fantastic quotes, some inspirational lines that highlight this. This one, whoever owns the land has thus assumed the divine functions of creating and destroying plants. Another one, the best definition of a conservationist is written not with a pen, but with an axe. And some deeper, meaningful ones. Conservation is paved with good intentions which prove to be futile or even dangerous because they're devoid of critical understanding either of the land or the economic land use. And one of my favorites, where a white pine and a red birch are crowding each other, I have an a priori bias. I always cut the birch to favor the pine. I love favoring pines too. I have a time cutting birch, but anyway. But Leopold wasn't the only one. When we think of our forestry past, Gifford Pinchot comes to the top of the list. We love to vilify Pinchot as more of a utilitarian and the battles with Muir and things like that. But I've pulled the first page of Gifford Pinchot's Primer of Forestry, written in 1900. And in the very first paragraphs of this introductory North American sort of Bible on forest management, the words here speak so deeply that they resonate today. And so if we read along here, the forest is the most highly organized portion of the vegetable world. It takes its importance less from the individual trees which help it form than the qualities which belong to it as a whole. Although it is composed of trees, the forest is far more than a collection of trees standing in one place. It has a population of animals and plants particular to itself, a soil largely of its own making, and a climate different in many ways from that of open country. Its influence upon the streams alone makes farming possible in many regions, and everywhere it tends to prevent floods and droughts. Then if we come over here, the forest is as beautiful as it is useful. Old fairy tales which spoke of it as a terrible place are wrong. No one can really know the forest without feeling the gentle influence of one of the kindliest and strongest parts of nature. From every point of view, it's one of the most helpful friends of man. Perhaps no other natural agent has done so much for the human race and has been so recklessly used and so little understood. Now, to me, that sounds like a conservationist, right? And a really important set of ideas. And it seems like we probably should have listened, formed our ethics based on some of Pinchot's writing. But it goes even further than that. When we get into the sort of history of civiculture, one of my favorites happens to be Heinrich Kade, a German civiculturist. And he wrote that there would be no forest science without deficiency in wood supplies. The science is only a child of necessity or need. And I really like when he gets into what he calls the three principal causes or that exist why forestry is still so backwards. The first one is the long time with which wood needs for its development. Speaking about having a little patience. Second, the great variety of sites on which it grows. Talking about understanding diversity. And thirdly, the fact that the forester who practices much writes but little, and the forester who writes practices but little. Again, getting into this idea of utility and science meshing together in ideas of getting things done. Basically, poking at people who talk a lot and don't do stuff, and people who do stuff and don't record it and write it down. And so when we look at our history, going back to the 1800s, even the 1600s, where John Evelyn and Silva defined a need for studying and managing the depleted forests in Europe, or Pliny the Elder in 77 CE documented forests and natural histories and talked about the importance of paying attention to our forests. And of course, first peoples around the world, their stories, their traditions, as well as their management went on for eons. There's a hypothesis out there that red pine here in the lake states was likely managed ever since its return post-glaciation. There were people here in this region before there was red pine, right? It started as a boreal system after the glaciers retreated, and it's very likely there were people here, and they helped shepherd red pine through the lake states, right? So forestry can help with a lot of the ways that we want to understand and fix habitat, and certainly with conservation. And furthermore, forestry with these hard skills I mentioned can have a really important role in all of our research, monitoring, and certainly the restoration of our conserved areas. At the heart of forestry is a course often called forest mensuration, which is the act and process or art of measuring, often called measurements now. It's very data heavy, ideas about number theory and how we collect good data and the precisions of numbers, right? Forestry for a long time, to this day, it's very, very data heavy. Forest biometry is another field, right? This grew out of early ideas of biometry and developed in simultaneous nature. And this is the application of statistical analysis to biological data. And there's some early forestry books that talk about biometry and mensuration that were written shortly after Pinchot wrote those books. Another 30 years before game management would come from Leopold. So there's a long history to this. And with these hard skills, things and ideas associated with numbers and processing data, as well as the natural history in forestry. There's the topic of silvics, which is the natural history of all the individual tree species, how they propagate, how they grow. Spend a lot of time in forestry understanding that, and that really helps understand uh, the habitat. And a big component of forestry has always been old term called plane surveying. We switched this over to all our GIS work now, but in every forestry course taught since the early bit was navigation, map making, and understanding our forests in a spatial nature. And then, of course, all the fun stuff that, in my experience, the undergrads love more than learning about forest mensuration is the hand tools, using chainsaws or herbicides, fire, things like that, getting their hands dirty and restoring the systems. And so there's a lot of hard skills associated with forestry that can benefit research, monitoring, and certainly getting the work done. I'll show you an example. So when we think of an image like this scene here, if you're from the Midwest, from the East Coast and in the hardwood forest, you look at this and you say, this is a typical hardwood forest. Now, if you know your species, you can say this is a northern hardwood forest. In it, we see some maple and some northern red oak. With forestry, we can get into the details. And so we can see we've got a species of mix here of aspen, oak, based on the size and site history and origin about 1930s or so. But we can get out there, and with the tools and techniques in forestry, we can understand this more than just a lovely little fall picture, but it actually has quite a bit of complexity to it. So we can measure that forest, we can dig in, and we can see a whoops, I lost my pointer here. We can see, if we look at the size distribution, approximate age distribution here by the density in these three different species groups. Our bigger trees are mostly aspen. We've got a little bit of struggling oak here and a lot of regeneration that happens to be maple. And so we can see that this mix, even though it's a mix of species, it tells us a whole lot. And our numbers, things like the average size and the density and the basal area, we can use those with some management diagrams. And we can look at our density here being almost 400 trees per acre. And our basal area puts us way up here at 150 on the chart, and our average size about there. So we're about here on this management diagram. We are way overstocked. Now, overstocked just means full. If we're growing these trees to make products quickly, we might consider it overstocked. But basically, we're looking at a forest that it consists of two forest types, two competing successional stages with a lot of competition. And with forestry tools, we can see that shade-tolerant species are slowly winning here. And with these tools, we can come up with management ideas like potentially reducing our overall competition in here to make it more of an open stand if our goal is to potentially support oak, if oak forest habitat is what we're after. So these hard skills are really, really important, but they also can help once we get into trying to communicate things and help with our conservation ideas, getting those across to the public. So when we think about conservation and communication, the knowledge, regardless whether it's forestry or anything, it gives us the ability to speak and understand the language that's used in conservation. For this, right, we can provide metrics for the conservation needs like targets. If we're thinking of maybe habitat specific to bobwhite quail, right? Bobwhite quail needs certain open canopy. If we're thinking of shade tolerant regeneration in northern hardwoods, in that example I just showed you, right? That's best when our basal area is around 80 square feet per acre, maybe a little less. If we're thinking of individual species, they all have specific habitat needs. A pileated woodpecker might prefer large 40 centimeter or bigger diameter trees at a fairly high density, at least 1.5 per hectare, right? These sorts of ideas give us targets that we can use to communicate about our habitat needs. And even some restoration things. When we think of some stands that may have been fire suppressed, these might generate, 10,000 board feet per acre if thinned, or 1,500 US dollars. So getting into those ideas, we can now start talking about the language of paying for fire operations, paying for invasive species work, and things like that. Now, those two statements I led with, this idea that the current rate of deforestation for logging in North America is a serious threat to wildlife conservation. And this other one, if we log selectively instead of using clear cuts, we can improve our forest ecosystems and still produce forest products. Now, those, again, I engineered those to be a little misleading. More precisely, if we wanted to say the ideas behind that, we would want to say something like some wildlife species have lost habitat because of our current forest harvesting practices. If we converted even age stands to uneven age stands, this could help, right? However, it would be a challenge because of the current timber markets. Less dynamic, less powerful, but accurate, because those first two things aren't really accurate. And so when we think about giving us the knowledge to speak and understand the language of conservation, we need to be able to communicate with researchers as well as loggers and potentially agency professionals and everybody in between. And accurate statements and ideas are key. Misconceptions, especially about forestry, are rampant and they're not really helpful. When we think about that statement that deforestation from logging is a threat to wildlife conservation, the fact of the matter, logging is not deforestation. Deforestation is the loss of a forest in its entirety, the conversion from a forest to ag land or a parking lot. That's deforestation. Logging is simply removing the trees. All right. And what's interesting when we think about deforestation, forest area and conditions in North America are actually kind of static. So we don't actually have a whole lot of deforestation happening except with development. And also, we love this term selectively. Selectively sounds better than clear cuts, but in strict terms, when we talk about selective management and forestry, traditionally, what we're talking about is pulling only the valuable, big, desired species out of that forest. It's called high grading. And what it does is it sets that forest up to be in a sensitive situation, maybe missing some of those species. It may, the only thing left are going to be damaged and degraded trees. And so, what people really mean when they say selectively is just not clear cuts, but what they mean is selection system silviculture. Selection, kind of like selective, right? Probably in forestry should have come up with different terms, but this is a system that is a whole lot more greatly appreciated, right? But the fact of the matter is it only works with shade tolerant species. And so for a lot of the management we do, selection system just isn't going to work. Because that brings me to another point when it comes with conservation communication, is this idea that all harvesting is a natural process, or the stuff that I see, the stuff that looks bad, is this awful thing. It can't be right. Well, it does have its problems, like I said, but the thing to consider is that all forests cycle. They go through temporal and spatial scales. All trees die. And what's important is the timing and the size of that disturbance is what's going to define that forest type. It's important for who is affected in the outcome of how that forest regenerates. And if we think of that, no matter where you are in the world, in all of our global forests, there's only four general forest types that we can see based on disturbance. Now, granted, they look different species, but in functionality, forests really only work four different ways. One of those ways happens to be through infrequent and severe disturbance. Things like canopy fire, large storms, things like that. These will favor shade intolerant species. So our forests that we have here in the Midwest, jack pine, lodgepole pine, spruce, subalpine fir, and arboreal forests, and our mountain forests, aspen, birch, things like that. One could even argue that some of the Doug fir, western hemlock systems in the Pacific Northwest might be um, cycled through these infrequent severe disturbances, but because it's 2, 3, 4, 500 years between these large fires, they appear fairly stable. But regardless, when these disturbances happen, you get a flush of regeneration and a new forest, even age regeneration. Now, the second type happens to be frequent low severity fires. These are mostly surface fire um, systems, right? Ponderosa pine, red pine here in the lake states, oak and hickory a little bit in the east, longleaf pine in the southeast, right? These sort of forests maintain themselves and maintain a position on the landscape by having two aged forests. The big ones that can survive the low burns, and we get some regeneration in some pockets in between the fires. And then the third system is a gap or an individual replacement, right? If a forest doesn't burn, isn't destroyed by a pathogen or blown down in a large storm, those trees are going to age, and individual sort of mortality events are going to cause small gaps in the forest. And these are propagated over and over through shade tolerant species regeneration. Our northern hardwoods, some of the old growth in the Pacific Northwest, right, until it probably is going to burn again every few hundred years. A lot of the systems that work in the tropics work this way. And regeneration is propagated through a release of shade tolerant species. And so when we think about these, our fourth one is actually what we have a lot of that needs fixing. And it's kind of a mix of one, two, or three. And the fixing is the fact that we don't have a clear winner here. We don't have a thing that is going to end up resulting, because there's a whole bunch of ways that this could go. And we've got different levels of fuel and changes in fire frequency and fire conditions, and can impact the regeneration of these species. Now, I bring this up because, like I said, when we're talking about forestry communication, understanding how these forests work is the basis of how we manage them and cut them down, right? The civicultural systems that we talk about, clear cuts, even age management, these are mimicking as best as they can those disturbance systems. Now, civiculture is defined by these age classes of regen. We've got even aged clear cuts, two age systems, shelter woods, seed trees, things like that, or uneven age, which is going to have at least three age classes or size cohorts. Now, the goal of each one of those is to maintain that system, regenerate those species and those conditions on that site. And that's what's happening in most of our forests. And so when we get into trying to understand these systems and be able to communicate, precise language and good understanding of what's actually happened is important. And that can lead to the final thing I want to talk about, which has to do with helping reframe our view of this whole conundrum we have of people in our forests, and help sort of reframe our views and our values. I went through my own personal evolution with this. I started as an ecologist. I was wondering, why do we keep doing things the way we're doing? The more I get into it, I can see that a lot of the ideas I had were actually misconceptions. And so in this figure here, um, this is a generalized, I lost my pointer again, reconstruction of what we think forest area was in these different regions. And so going back to late 1700s up until the 2000s. And you can see we did lose forests, especially in the South and especially in the North, right? This is where agriculture took over. In the interior West and the Pacific Coast, we've lost some, but not that much, right? And so ideas about deforestation in North America already happened, right? And they're only happening now with development. Our forests are the way they are on the landscape because we're maintaining them. Now, I'm not saying that all is good. Now, it is true that we may very well likely have more trees in North America than we did pre 1600s. But the problem is we're growing them really, really dense. We've got some less forest area, but we've excluded fire. And the forests that we have are no longer sort of natural in this sense, but we're favoring a lot of commercial species growing in plantations. I bring this up because this information is important for us to understand when we start talking about forestry issues, especially related to habitat. Because believe it or not, we have a sustainability model in North American forestry. And that sustainability model means we're basically just maintaining what we have now. The damage has already been done. And so, this idea that we're really losing a lot in our forests, we've already lost it. We're just not maintaining what we could possibly benefit a whole suite of species, right? So what we have now on the landscape is pretty much what in industrial forestry we're trying to maintain, certainly on public lands. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about that can also kind of help reframe our views is a really important thing in my eyes, right? Is the fact that forest products are still really, really useful to us. We've got a long history of using wood for good reasons. It's an amazingly valuable resource. It's strong and it's flexible. It's durable, but it's beautiful. In Venice in the 1500s, the entire city is built on sunken alder poles. In Norway, there's some structures going back to the 1300s. There's a church in England from the 800s. There's a temple from the 600s in Japan. And there's a well that they uncovered in Czechoslovakia that goes back to 5000 BC. And even a wood not used by a Homo sapiens, but the Clacton spear, likely a Neanderthal tool, found in the UK, buried in a bog going back 400,000 years. Now, forest products are incredibly useful. And if we value conservation, I'd like to make the argument that forest products can help us, right? They're a naturally occurring ecosystem service in a general sense. Most of the forests here in North America are naturally sort of maintained, not a huge amount of plantations. Native species we're using in their native ranges, generally no inputs. There's some fertilization in the southeast, but generally speaking, we don't have to do anything, unlike agriculture. Other parts that are important is this is a very it's still pretty carbon intensive, but it's less intensive than using metal or concrete. And it's certainly going to be less toxic than using plastic, and it happens to be biodegradable. And quite frankly, when we think about society and the things that are important, this is a piece of paper, the oldest piece of paper that we have, as best as I can determine. It's a Chinese piece of actual paper, not parchment, but ground up wood fiber, and it's a map, and it's about 1000 BC. Think of the value in your life of having access for paper, for all the amazing things you can do, right? Love letters, change people's lives with a simple note on a piece of paper, as well as all the personal hygiene stuff. When we think about a life without some of the other stuff, this happens to be a piece of flame maple turned into a Les Paul guitar played by Jimmy Page in '73. I can't imagine my life without this important forest product, right? But that is not so much the forest products that we um, focus on. Most of the stuff is in this sawn wood, pulp, and a lot of chemistry that comes out of the pulping of wood. And actually, you may not probably be buying a lot of two by fours. You may be unaware of all the chemicals that enter our product chains through pulping, but I know you use this a lot, right? This is a huge component of our forest products world now, and we still use a lot. In fact, we use about the same amount of forest products as we have for quite a long time. This is wood production and consumption here in the US. And so even though we do have plastic and we do have things that have replaced paper, we're still using a lot of forest products. The challenge is we're importing a lot more now. Here is a figure showing our vast majority in the global production or consumption of paper. The majority of it is wrapping and packaging. We think about writing paper, we think about the important bits. Those are stable, if not dropping, whereas container board and products are driving the market. Now, it's important to realize that the average American, we use about 8 trees a year and just in paper alone. And if we were to take all the merchantable trees on Earth and divide them up equally amongst all our 8 some billion people, you get 400 trees per person, and we use 8 alone, right? And so most of our trees, unfortunately, have a use, and a big use of that is going to be in paper products. Now, one of the things to think about with forest management, and especially this idea of lots of vast changes in our lifetime and what we're seeing, this is a graph showing sawn coniferous woods, basically 2 by 4s. And this line here is the US production. So for about 50 years, we've made the same amount of 2 by 4s. When it comes to plywood, plywood's decreased because other countries are starting to make it, like China. Our pulp harvest here peaked around the 90s and has decreased and is decreasing. This is only 2013. And our production of paper here in the States is decreasing and has tanked here in the last 10 years. But it's coming from somewhere. And this purple line here shows that China is now the world's leading largest or the largest producer of paper, and they're getting it from all these other countries. Now, I bring this up and that long-winded thing, we're running short on time here, but I'm almost done. But when we think of our value system and why we value these, here's a picture of a recent aspen clear cut in my neck of the woods. This is not a pretty sight. We don't like looking at it, right? The value of this for habitat can be questioned, carbon storage, fire risk, things like that. But when we look at this paired with the aspen monoculture behind it, this is actually a little bit better than that for a lot of reasons, right? Diversity of habitat. It still ain't pretty. I don't like looking at it, but I've come to realize my values and views have changed because I'm willing to live with this because I don't like this. And this is where a lot of pulp is coming from now. These are eucalyptus plantations, and these are happening all over the tropics. Eucalyptus is a non-native species. They're growing it in areas in expense of the native tropical forests, and we can see that we have a lot of change in forest area in the tropics. And so when we think of our conservation values, it helps us kind of inform maybe our choices. Here's a product that seems really neat. You may still find this at your local co-op. Bamboo toilet paper with a cute name. Who gives a crap? But Does it make sense for us to buy toilet paper, even though bamboo is an amazing product? We're not growing bamboo in this hemisphere, right? This is coming from the other side of the earth. We're wiping our butts with a fiber grown in Southeast Asia at the expense of native systems down there. So if we value conservation, I think forestry education and understanding helps us understand things like maybe we shouldn't necessarily outsource our production. We should think about global markets and reducing our carbon costs, and we should think about trying to fix what's broken in our own forests first. So I'll finish with this long list of things I thought were wrong in our forests. Too many successional shifts, not enough fire, and actually not enough harvesting. And so through forest science, I've learned over the years that we need to do a number of things to fix this. I'm convinced we actually need to cut more area, but when we cut, we need to leave more stuff in those cuts. We need to leave reserve trees and snags and coarse woody debris. We need to burn more. We need to pay more for our products. We certainly need to learn more, and we better stop harvesting trees that are older than Gifford Pinchot's book. There's no reason to cut old growth anymore. We only have a little bit, most of it's already gone. But the other thing that's, I think, really important is that we need to support what we have and do in our forests. And we need to do that um, by figuring out what needs fixing through research and monitoring, start paying attention with things. And I think there's a big aspect working with private landowners. When we're looking at some of the policies we've seen, the ideas of shifting policies in our public lands, there's still a lot of private landowners out there where finances aren't the deciding factor. And so when we think about forestry, it's really similar to where we have come with wildlife management. What we've got here in North America is pretty good. It's not perfect, and it certainly can be better. And so I hope you all potentially want to learn and do a little bit more. And so I went a little long. I apologize for that. If there's some questions, please reach out. And I do have another quick survey here of some potential courses that I've thought about. Some of this I used to offer at Northland College. If there's things like this that you think you'd be interested in or potential value at the Center for Wildlife Studies, please tick those off and I'll keep a tally of this. But other than that, thank you so much. And please reach out if you have some questions.
Thanks, John. That was fantastic. Even as a wildlife guy, it's always nice to hear about the home states back in the Midwest.
There you go.
Put a link to John's class with CWS in the chat there. Easy enough to track down, of course. And this is great information. Hopefully, you can get this from you, John, about interest in other classes.
Absolutely.
If you have a minute for questions, that's up to you, John. If folks have some, feel free to speak up.
Absolutely. I could talk about this all day. I almost have. But yes, if people are willing to stick around and ask some questions, by all means.
Can you see the chat?
There we go. I was looking for it. There we are. I can see the chat now. There we are. Oh, we got a question here from Paige. Curious about thoughts on managing a desired mix of successional stages. According to, usually defined according to HRV. I'm not familiar with that acronym. There we go. I can see more. Oh, historic range of variability. Yes. Um, yeah, that's the sort of idea that I think is really important is when we look at that landscape. Most of what we do with forest management is a patchwork of things, and we track them and we maintain them, and they're that way because they were that way last time. And so when we think of forest management, a much more distributed approach, I believe, allows us to have the sort of production that is required. And certainly, if we can reuse and reduce our needs a little bit more, we don't necessarily have to harvest as much. I don't think that's going to help a ton. But if we kind of distribute this idea, there was a Bob Seymour is a civiculturist at University of Maine and sort of championed this idea, or he claims he stole it from others, I think, or utilized some other ideas earlier on, but a 30-30-30 approach where we have some sort of sacrificial areas where intensive management occurs. And then we have some areas where we are managing in these alternative approaches for alternative species, but we're still pulling from it. And then we have some no-touch areas where we're letting things happen. And so right now we basically have two, right? We're battling over conservation areas and we're battling over trying to maximize production. And somewhere in the middle, I think, is a place where we can have the actual space needed for older rotations and this sort of desired mix of what we might see. The Lake States is a great example. You drive everywhere and you see red pine plantations and aspen management. Um, Long gone are the, 200-year-old pineries and things like that. Now, the Forest Service here is doing an amazing job of maintaining some barrens and savanna type systems. They burn, I don't know, a couple thousand acres a year and maintain 25,000 acres of habitat, which used to be strictly used for red pine production. And so with sharp-tailed grouse habitat was sort of the vector, and they use that to create a system where they're still growing pines. They're just not as dense, and they're still harvesting. And then there's big areas where there's no trees at all. But yeah, great question. Ooh, yes, Jay, great question. When we think about invasive species, it's a mess. And so when um, one of the vectors for invasive species is certainly moving logging equipment from one infested site to another. The um, the majority of our wood is coming from places without much of a problem yet. But it's still there and the potential's high. And so when we think of big changes, especially with clear-cut silviculture, even age management, the point is to give a lot of light. And if a thing is there that is an invasive species and can outcompete, it's going to have a big role. Now, for a long time in these sorts of management systems, any weed or any competing plant was deemed a weed. And so um, the current way that we in the Pacific Northwest and red pine management here in the States, and I think probably a lot of work in the Southeast, is site preparation uh, is a pretty good way of getting rid of invasive species in these clear-cut areas. The challenge is the site preparation means they're using a lot of spray. Um, they're burning, but not necessarily in the right way. They're basically trying to make that forest stand after harvest fairly easy for the planting crews to come in. And so for me, I'm less worried about invasive species where there's this really intensive management because they're keeping eyes on it and they want everything that's not a tree dead in those early stages. After the trees are released, then it really doesn't matter. Um, it's to me, the biggest issue of invasive species is coming from the areas where we're not on the ground as much and people aren't paying attention. And that's where they sneak in. And it's those sorts of conditions that favor a lot of the invasives I'm familiar with in the Midwest, things like the invasive honeysuckle species and buckthorn. These are incredibly shade tolerant and more so than a lot of the desired species, even in completely intact forests. And so, yeah, invasive species are a big threat. There's actually a Kate, what's her? I can't remember her last name. She's a researcher for the National Park Service, and she did an amazing bit of work on the East Coast forests, which a lot of their origins are a lot older, and the infestation date is a lot older. And she's got a phenomenon in her forests that she studied of a regeneration debt. And so we may have some of these conserved areas with these really old stately oak trees that might be pushing 300, 400 years old now, and they're starting to age out. And as they die, the only thing in the understory is invasive species because there hasn't been successful regeneration of some of those hardwood species. And so, yeah, it's a scary thing. And so, yeah, invasive species I think are one of the things that you just have to be on all the time. And there's no easy solution. Um, Maintaining good swamp conifer cover, cedars and hemlocks here in the Lake States has actually shown that it can be dark enough under those to actually limit buckthorn, which is pretty good. So, converting a lot of forests to those things in conservation areas and private forests could have a big impact. But yeah, great question. Anybody else there?
Some of this feels very familiar. The legacy against fire and harvest seems very much like predators on the wildlife side. And so
Exactly.
probably a lot of the same history behind
Yes.
them. I
Yes.
amazed when I read Holbrook's book, Burning an Empire, how much things had changed in just a few decades from viewing fire as the absolute enemy, which in some of those case studies, it certainly was wiping out entire towns and whatnot. But
Yes.
there's
Yep.
certainly some analogies there with the predator side.
Yes. Yeah. The challenge when we um, move from nomadic people to non-nomadic people with structures we don't want to burn, and then start keeping animals that we don't want eaten. Um, the impact
And just
that's had
understanding,
on what we see, yeah,
yeah, just
it's
not
amazing.
understanding the role that they play in keeping the systems at large healthy, and it's
Yeah.
been a
Yep.
steep still.
No, I dream of a world where the cougars have been restored to the lake states and people are burning their lawns like we used to mow our grass. Um, I dream of that world. Little dangerous world, but it'd be pretty fun to live in, I think. Um, well, if there aren't any other questions, I thank everyone for hanging out and hopefully enjoying the long-winded rant on forest issues. And yeah, please consider taking the course either this go around or hopefully in the future. Thanks for your feedback on these questionnaires, and I wish you all well. Take care.
Yeah, and just echo John. Thank you everyone for tuning in. In the next 3 months, I'm excited to say we're going to have a little bit of a change. We're having a three-part series on behavior, both on the human and wildlife side, and how those can be used on the human side for promoting conservation, helping understand the challenges globally. And that's going to be with Dr. Dulce Escalosan. She'll be presenting the first two of these series, and then Stephanie Wilkes will be presenting on wildlife behavior in May, I believe. Let's hope you folks can tune in for that. We'll have those posted on the website soon for registration. Mostly thank you, John. This was great. Really appreciate the time you put into this. And again, if anyone has questions, reach out to us anytime. And feel free to email any of us. Our contact information is on the website. And hopefully we will see folks here at future talks.